Hey there, welcome back. Hopefully you went and enjoyed a good pork snack during our break time there. Just kidding. So let's wrap up our conversation with Unit 6 and swine feeds. So we'll first talk about the different types of diets that you might encounter in swine feeding rations. First things first, let's hit on pre-starters. That would be those baby pigs less than 3 weeks of age. We're probably going to have a crude protein density in those rations somewhere between 20 and 24% crude protein. Probably going to be some milk protein like whey included in that diet, a fair amount of fat, and I'm talking about a maximum of that 5 to 7%. It might be less than that, depending on the ration, because we don't want to get it too sticky and chewy. They won't eat it that way either. Here's where one of the times that you'll see some sugar introduction into rations, and that's not uncommon all the way through here anymore to talk specifically about sugar. Most likely a medication, and this feed is probably going to be presented as a pellet or a crumble because it's probably going to be so fine and so dusty. We want to make sure and be able to spray some whey protein over the top of that in order to encourage feed intake. Then let's move over across the slide and talk about starter diets. So that 3 to 6 week time frame, that age up to somewhere around 40, 50 pounds of body weight. Now we're going to drop down to about an 18 to 20% crude protein diet. Probably going to have some medication in this still. Now we're going to start to transition up to about half of the diet, half of the grain content is most likely corn or some appropriate substitute carbohydrate-wise. And still probably most likely pelleted at this stage of the game in order to, again, help support that feed intake. Transition then to the grow-finish diet. Again, we continue to kind of drop down our crude protein feeding rate percentages to about 14 to 16. Here we're talking that 40 to 120 pounds body weight. So again, now we really transition into that classic corn and soybean meal-based diet. Medication may be optional at this point in time, and now you start to lose your efficiency in terms of pelleting. You lose that economic and average daily gain feed efficiency advantage of pelleting. So sometimes you may see some transition to a meal format here. And then lastly, the finisher diet, again, dropping down that crude protein to the final level of about 12 to 14%. And these are those pigs that are going to be somewhere in that 120 pounds to market weight, 250, 275, 280 pounds, whatever it might be. Again, extremely energy dense ration. Optional medication only as needed, and making sure that we adhere to withdrawal times as we reach the end of the phase here if we are in fact feeding medication. And this is most likely in meal form. There will be some that feed pellet all the way through, but again, you kind of lose your economic advantage and your feed efficiency and average daily gain advantages once you reach that finishing phase. So some dietary feeding systems to compare just a little bit here. First, we got to think, compare the simple versus complex diet. This is covered in your textbook. Most everything today is a complex diet. And really the difference between the two is the number of ingredients in the presentation that we offer it in. And almost everything today includes some byproducts and some additional things in order to help support efficiency, average daily gain, and do it profitably. That almost all pig diets are complex in today's industry. The simple diets would be very historical, just basically corn and soybean meal and maybe a mineral pack, and that would be it. And maybe even more traditional than that, some roasted soybeans on the farm, which you almost never find nowadays in the industry. So that's a simple versus complex. Full feed versus limit fed is as it suggests. So full feed is what we would say ad libitum. So the animal can eat as much as they want, as often as they like. And so feed is available all the time, hopefully to support full genetic expression, and it's typically the most feed efficient. There is some minimal cases where we might suggest limit feeding, and that's primarily to manage weight gain. And we've noted a few of those as we've gone through here. Complete feed versus free choice. Again, here kind of a more modern versus a more traditional concept. Basically, all commercial diets offered today in today's industry in most pig barns are complete feeds. So essentially, all ingredients are mixed into one presentation and presented at one time. There's no buffet option as far as that goes, where they can select different ingredients at different times in different places. That basically, again, is extinct in today's industry. Dry versus liquid, almost all feeds are presented in a dry nature. Even though pigs really love moisture in their feed, they love that. It will increase feed consumption and has a moderate effect on feed efficiency. It's just not very effective in today's effective or practical in today's presentation systems. And then lastly, and perhaps the biggest one and most relevant one to compare on the slide here, is meal versus pelleted. And it really depends on the stage of production, what's most appropriate and effective and cost conscious. Pelleting should improve feed efficiency and average daily gain 5 to 10%. It decreases dust accumulation. It's more palatable and reduces waste. But if you're not capturing a lot of those things, then it may not be worth it, and tends, like I said, the advantage tends to erode as the pigs get older. Some other processing considerations. Again, cannot emphasize the pelleting decision enough, and I've kind of hit that, I think, pretty well. But I want to compare that and contrast it a little bit with poorly processed diets. And whenever we have diets that are not consistent particle size, there's variation, inadequate blending, that creates problems with sorting. Pigs are very, very adept at taking their nose and pushing the feed side to side, sorting out the things that taste better. And if your grind and presentation mixing is not adequate and you have hot spots of corn and hot spots of soybean meal, they will sort those things out, and that will create inefficiencies in gain. That will create health problems like ulcers and things of that nature that you do not want to deal with. So make sure that you are processing your diet effectively. Grinding and rolling, and most of it is ground, hammer mill ground more specifically, and we're talking about that fineness of grind about 500 to 600 microns. So exceedingly fine. And again, if we are doing this in a feed mill, we have quality assurance that's going to help track that stuff in order to make sure that our grind is uniform. It's the appropriate fineness, but not too fine, so that we create really dusty feeds and intake problems. So, what might be included in swine diets? And I'm certainly not going to get them all listed here, but absolutely, going backwards there. There we go. Certainly, corn and soybean meal. Corn being the primary carbohydrate source, and economically, you have to consider other things and what specific carbohydrates and sugars that different ingredients present. Soybean meal, almost always the main crude protein source, and it has the widest amino acid profile, so it's going to give you a great base of amino acids to work from. Often you'll find an animal protein source. We'll hit on perhaps what a couple of those feeds might be later on, but that diversifies your amino acid delivery. Macro minerals, again, super important. The 4 that are listed there are not the only 4 that are important, but the most likely to be deficient, and that's kind of how we've listed these here. And of the macro minerals, and especially all minerals, pigs have a very, very high salt requirement and is the largest of the macro mineral needs of pigs. Micro minerals are listed there, which are most likely to be deficient: iron, copper, iodine, selenium, and zinc. Vitamins are listed there as well that are most likely to be deficient. And then we have to think about fat feeding, which I've mentioned a couple times as we go through here. And it might be tallow, it might be vegetable oil, it might be a different blend of fat. But essentially we're talking about utilizing those to increase energy density. So for every 1% of added fat, we should get a 2% response in feed efficiency. And especially in baby pigs, it increases survivability about 2 to 3%. Once you get above 3% inclusion, Then we get some back fat thickness response, which of course is a carcass trait that we're very, very interested in. So we're probably going to include fat at a substantial rate as we go along. So let's talk some specific ingredients. I've mentioned dried whey. It's about 11% crude protein. We've utilized it in some different presentations and case studies already, especially in pre-starter and starter diets. It's exceedingly digestible and palatable, and it might be as much as 10 to 30% inclusion in those early pig diets. Blood meal, mentioned an animal protein source, and here it is, 78% crude protein, perhaps about 4 to 7% inclusion, and that inclusion refers to the percent of the total mix that it might be in the diet. So a 4% inclusion on a 100-pound mix would be 4 pounds, okay, just to give you an example. You'll also see the opportunity to feed additives and synthetic amino acids in order to meet those needs. Copper sulfate is extremely important, and you can't exceed 250 parts per million in pigs, otherwise it becomes toxic. But we need that to support growth and feed efficiency. Zinc to prevent parakeratosis, which would be a real drying and cracking of the skin. And zinc uptake is actually inhibited whenever we feed high levels of soybean meal. So there's a antagonistic effect between those two ingredients. Some other things that are listed here in terms of feed ingredients: probiotics, organic acids, enzymes. All of those are targeted to support the gastrointestinal tract, increase digestibility, feed efficiency, things of that nature, metabolically, that are important for helping support pig growth and development. You might use flavoring agents, mold inhibitors like clays whenever appropriate. Pellet binders, if we're using that early on, might be appropriate as well. As we get to the end here and think about a couple miscellaneous things. Confinement versus pasture rearing. Again, you find very, very few pigs raised outside anymore. Almost all of it is moved to indoor commercial confinement management, basically to improve feed efficiency, average daily gain, profitability, much less disease risk, and you cannot stress enough how much better it is for the environment. Pigs are very, very, very hard on their environment outside. They make a complete mess. They destroy a landscape. So they're much, much more efficient in confinement. Lastly, then, we have to think about the nutrient environmental impact with which we handle and feed pigs. The feeding program has a high correlation to the nitrogen and phosphorus excretion in the manure and urine. And so we have to have a plan for that manure. We have to have a plan for how it will be applied to fields. And we have to have a plan to manage dust and odor so we are friendly neighbors. So those are critical components to think about as well in your feeding program. So your take-home messages here, and you can stare at the bacon at the right-hand side and think about that for breakfast in the morning. But basically, have a really good knowledge of your swine life cycle feeding program and the approaches and options that are available. Understand it's very, very much about feed efficiency. You'll hear swine producers talk about that at a high level. Understand what additives and what feeds are available at different times, what economic impact they make, and when to add them in the diet, and then formulate them carefully with cost in mind. So I thank you for tuning in to this unit. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I will see you in class.